except that I will say that what has happened in our country that has caused a lot of this is that stocks in companies like this are no longer owned typically by individuals. They're owned by intermediaries, like you said, pension funds, insurance companies, money mutual funds.
Correct.
People are being encouraged not to invest directly, but to invest through these managers.
Correct.
The managers are demanding short-term performance. And so if you are managing one of these firms and you don't go along with this, you don't look very good compared to the people who do, short-term. And their focus is so short-term that typically the managers are going to get replaced if they don't go along with that.
So if they see that this isn't sustainable, if they say we can't keep doing this because we're going to hit a wall, this can't go on, they're gone.
A lot of them resigned and left. Others, you know, said, look, that's what I got to do it. And they got paid very well for it. So, you know, the system got to the point where people kept on doing this long after any common sense would have said, don't do it anymore.
Yeah. Now again,
and that's where common sense people can see this, where the people that get at the top of one of these big institutions, they get caught up in this and they don't really see what they're doing. Just as the Congress can get caught up with how well this is going and pushing Fannie and Freddie to do more and more of this business, even though they didn't have the capital to absorb the kind of risk they were taking.
Well, and also in Fannie and Freddie, there's been a lot of talk about how many people in Fannie and Freddie, including very many political figures, actually benefited, and they were getting these bonuses because were they acting pretty much like these loan brokers you were talking about? That they would get hundreds of thousands. Their base salary was $500,000 and they got $700,000 in bonuses by making these loans they seem to me a little bit different because, again, they were saying the government's going to pay for these. So it's a little bit different than taking any sort of accountability within your company.
It was a dreadfully flawed model. Fannie and Freddie used to be government institutions, and they were privatized. But the flawed model is they were privatized with everybody believing that the federal government would make good on any of their debts.
Right.
And that allowed them to borrow so much money and to leverage their own equity so far. Now, that's where you get the meltdown we have now. So now, let's take somebody like Lehman Brothers, a company that actually went bankrupt, losing everything for its investors.
And it seemed like it happened overnight.
It looked like it happened overnight, but what really happened, here's a company that was leveraged 30 to 1.
Right.
Remember we talked about what's appropriate for a lender. You got to be able to absorb your losses. Well, they weren't complete fools in that they were holding a lot of risky assets, leveraged 30 to 1, which means a 3% decline wiped out their shareholders.
Right.
That's a tiny movement in the way the things go in the world. A lot of what they did, though, was they would enter into contracts with other companies to offset their risk. So if you were carrying, for example, a toxic security secured by subprime mortgages, you could turn around and get another firm, a bank or a Merrill Lynch, to guarantee you against the loss there.
But why would Merrill Lynch or the bank do that?
Well, they would do that because they get paid fees, and that would cause income, and they get paid fees, and that would cause they would be reported as income. So they would look good. But why is the whole system collapsing?
Right.
It's because you have one firm that's leveraged 30 to 1, buying insurance from another firm that's leveraged 30 to 1, or in the case of AIG, 100 to 1. So basically, everybody could say, look, I've offset all my risk. I don't have any risk. But in reality, the whole system was at risk.
Like a house of cards.
That's right. That's why when Lehman Brothers went bankrupt, the problems rippled through the entire world because they had taken on billions of dollars of promises to other people to offset their losses. Those promises were worthless. AIG's promises are worthless. So what's happened is you have all of that was built up with so very little capital underneath it. And so the problem is systemic. It goes through all of our major banks and all of these major institutions. Now, so they're all fighting for survival.
Yeah, and one of the things that I think we hear a lot about with Congress, and again, I don't understand this because if in fact you have regulators and you don't pay attention to them and they don't have any power to stop you, why have regulation at all? I think that if an industry, or let's say Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, if they had regulators, I think it gives a false sense of security because you think, well, if there's a regulatory agency looking over them, obviously they can't get out of control, but that is not the case because they were ignored. So my question is, these other groups, whether it's AIG as an insurance company or a bank or an investment firm, do you think regulation is the way to go, or do you think that just gives you a false sense of security?
Well, we'll talk about what to do later, but,
Okay.
yeah, regulation has that downside in that people thought that these were regulated institutions
Certainly.
that were therefore sound. And why didn't that work? Well, the regulators are kind of overwhelmed. Remember, the number of regulators relative to the number of banks out there doing all this business are relatively small. And you know, the people who are in these businesses, let's just talk about Countrywide for a moment, because there's just been something out on Chris Dodd and his
Yes.
loans from Countrywide. So suppose now you have a bank that's regulated, it's making a lot of very questionable loans. The regulators come in and they look at that and they say, what's going on here? But you have that same bank making favorable loans to a prominent senator who then turns around and says, what are you guys doing? This is working. They're making it possible for hundreds of thousands of people to own homes that never owned them before. So you get political interference. And the people who run these institutions know very well what they're doing when they make favorable loans to politicians or to officials in Fannie and Freddie. I mean, all of this gets to be very, very difficult. So the regulators are overwhelmed by the number of banks they have to watch over, and they also get interfered with.
Well, yeah, and so the interference, is it, again, when I see these YouTube tapes, the regulator is saying to them, you have been over, you have broken the rules, you have broken the law, you have not done things correctly. Nothing happened. Is that government, is that political interference?
Well, of course it is, but it's not quite so clear as you've broken the law. It's always judgment. In other words, how many of these are bad loans? And it depends on your assumptions. If you assume that house prices in California will continue on rising forever,
Which we did.
They're all good loans. Who's going to sit around and say, well, house prices collapsed in California in the early 1990s. What if it happens again? Well, a lot of people don't want to hear that.
Right.
And so it is difficult for the regulators.
But my understanding, I remember in some of these tapes, and again, they're on YouTube, very easy to see, that they did do things incorrectly. They did do things that were not to be done. It's not like they were just, it's not just that the judgment was flawed, it's that they actually did things that should have been corrected.
Okay, I was probably looking to the regulations of the banks.
No, I'm talking about that agency over Freddie and Freddie.
Well, Fannie and Freddie were guilty of accounting infractions.
Correct.
They were cooking the books.
Correct.
And that caused people to lose their jobs ultimately, and for that to be corrected. But yes, that was being interfered with.
Back in 2004.
Yes, it was being interfered with, and that's the problem with regulation. Because nothing is perfect. The people who were doing these things were taking improper risks, and now we as taxpayers are paying for that.